I'm Andrian. Today we're going to be kicking off our psychology series with a very special guest.
So hi, I'm Dr. Jens Schmidt, Program Director of the PsyD program at SCU. It's a PsyD in psychodynamic psychology.
So Jens, you prepared for us a few topics today to discuss.
I think what I really wanted to talk about is the subject of trauma. And I think trauma is really important in psychology, but maybe to explain it a little bit before. The term trauma actually comes out of medicine, and it actually refers to the injury to tissue. So psychology took that in, and so it's really interesting because I think, as Judith Herman points out, that when trauma occurs to us, it actually tears the fabric of life.
So trauma never had anything really to do with like the mental, it was more a physical term that they coined?
Yes, originally
so
really a physical term about tissue damage. So Judith Herman points out that it's basically the tissue of life, of how we see life, of the context of how we view ourselves in the context of life. Trauma is so interesting because it really points to an external event in so many ways. It's really disruptive. And what it does to the mental apparatus, it overwhelms the entire system. It actually overwhelms not just the mental system, but also the physiological system.
So when you say like, it damages the mental system, what do you characterize as this tear? Like, is this tear in the emotional and the mental state, or?
It's basically in all ways. It is about how we respond. So there's a really somatic and physiological aspect to it. Mm-hmm. So when we say, and that's actually something that even Freud determined. So in his earliest theory, he talked about trauma, and there was an explanation for hysteria, which was a common disease that women were diagnosed that they couldn't really explain. But he said, in his very original trauma theory, that the mental apparatus gets overwhelmed with excitation. There's too much energy. So when we think about something that really gives a shock to our system, we react to that, right? I mean, we get a really, really bad news.
Right.
And we will feel that physiologically. We get hot or we get cold or
like
nauseous.
You start flushing and then you start sweating.
Sweating, our eyes start to flutter, our throat might scratch. So these are all physiological reactions that have to do with a lot of energy. Freud basically said if something really shocking happens, the whole system gets overwhelmed.
Okay.
And as a result, the person gets flooded with so much excitation and anxiety that things cannot be processed anymore. So the system may shut down, or
and you're saying like sometimes trauma can be invoked by all of these emotions coming at once.
Yes. Usually when we talk about, the classic diagnosis of PTSD, it means there has to be an external stimulus that is so severe that the person reacts in a very specific way with a traumatic shock.
Oh my gosh, and every time they recount this shock or every time they experience this shock, it kind of brings back
the whole state.
Oh, that's so interesting.
So it can result in people freezing up, in people having flashbacks, and in people losing a sense of the reality. So,
and it doesn't necessarily have to be related to the incident that happened before. It's just that feeling of like sweaty hands, anxiety.
Right. And this is the interesting part, as a lot of trauma specialists and experts point out. When the system gets overwhelmed, memory changes, because we can, to simplify it, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, and the very primitive parts of the brain that are there for survival, that are almost, reptilian, they take over. So we talk about the amygdala, that is very much about emotional processing and survival. So we have these typical survival responses: fight, flight, freeze. There's another form that is almost like, everything shuts down. The freeze response is one of high activation, where people are, but they are frozen.
So normally the prefrontal cortex would control this emotion, this
Yes.
drive.
Right. So when we have the prefrontal cortex is for understanding and processing, things in a logical and rational way. And so that develops over time. And so if we have a good functioning prefrontal cortex, we have access to our memory, our thinking. We can, be rational and understand what's going on. But under high stress, we all know that we don't learn that well. If we are highly anxious, we cannot contain and retain information.
So I'm guessing there's a few stages of trauma too, completely shutting down, anxiety, and then stages below and above that.
And it depends a little bit on a lot of factors, on the person's constitution, how they are built. Some people have a highly responsive nervous system, and others, from birth on, are just more, relaxed and, calmer and not as responsive to stimuli.
So tell us a bit more about the nervous system and how it plays into the role. I'm sure you're not talking about getting sick nervous system.
I mean, when we think about reactions to bigger events, the nervous system has to be there, so it's helpful that we have a nervous system that reacts and puts us into alert if there's a difficult situation or a threat, that we get alert. And so, that we have, when there's a bigger task, that we have adrenaline, and that helps us. It helps us to run or to perform. But if there's too much, we will be distressed, so there are cortisol responses and so on.
Right. Is this the same nervous system that when we get an illness, it responds to it by making our body do different things, or?
What you refer to is more the immune system in some way.
Okay, we'll get that out.
It's it's actually really important, because the immune system is also influenced by this nervous system. And when we have, a real strong traumatic reaction, the immune system will be affected too.
Okay.
And actually it will often lower the immune system. So people who have a lot of traumatic experiences may have a lowered immune system and are more likely to also deal with somatic responses and illness, and possibly developing chronic illnesses. They are also, if we think about highly traumatized people, there's a danger for them to try to self-medicate, so there's a higher likelihood to get into substance abuse and so on. But just if we go back to the beginning and we think about how disruptive it is, so often enough what people who have been traumatized, they cannot recall. They are not good witnesses, because in this traumatized state, they may not recall all the details of the event. And because their prefrontal cortex didn't process everything and couldn't take everything in, because they were in overload.
And is there a case where they might process things differently that associate with their past experiences and testify incorrectly?
Yes, so
or recall incorrectly?
First, yes. So one part is they may not memorize it at all. It may become dissociated as a defense, because it's so painful and stressful that they cannot recall a lot. Sometimes it's also good to not recall every aspect, so it's a helpful defense in that sense. But what is often recalled in a different way, and that's what one of the trauma experts, very famous Bessel van der Kolk, points out. He has written a whole book with a great title, "The Body Keeps the Score."
Oh, the
So the body remembers, so it's physiologically remembered that memory can come up. You might be in a very different situation. Let's say you have an experience with an authority figure who was highly abusive, and now you sit in the classroom and something triggers that memory, and you suddenly have the experience that this person is really dangerous and is out to get you. And so that's a body memory. So it's a lived memory. It becomes alive in that moment, and suddenly you feel really threatened by the teacher.
Oh, it's like in the books and movies where they say, like, you know, they touch their shoulder and they flinched or something.
Yes. Because the body has that reaction, and the person may not recognize that as a memory.
Oh my God.
They just experience that in that moment. And so this is, I think, what makes it so interesting to understand when people have these very strong reactions.
I guess it could be taken positively too as well, because I remember there are some times where I met some like childhood friends a long time ago. I would like jump on his back because that's what we used to do, and I didn't even recall doing that at all. So
yes, so a lot of our memories are filled, have that kind of emotional component, and they just come back in other situations and other relationships. So we know from trauma that this is stored in a different way, and people, you know, have trouble going back, and it's profoundly disruptive, you know, to our life. So if something like the fires in LA, people losing their home, that's highly traumatic, and it's an outside event, and or you know, dealing with COVID, people really fearing for their life, and or having, you know, getting sick or losing loved ones. So these are, you know, profound outside events that have an impact. You know, they can get to that point that they are really traumatic. One aspect is that it creates physiological changes. So a highly traumatized body will become more, might have a lot of stress load. So they may become, you know, are more vigilant. So they become more alert to stressors and feel possibly much more easily triggered to go into a fight or flight or freeze response.
okay, and that leads into like anxiety as well.
Yes. So part of that is, you know, in that fight response, that anxiety or the threat is turned into anger. So I have to defend myself. I have to fight. You know, I have to be really aggressive. So sometimes we see that in you know, people who have been in combat and are traumatized. So, and they might have flashbacks, and they might, you know, turn around a corner in their own house, and suddenly they, you know, they are startled by their wife coming out of the hallway, and they are back in that combat experience, you know.
Yeah,
they get that full-blown flashback and struggle in that situation.
Okay. And then the recovery process is probably very long to unlearn that muscle memory for it.
Right. That's a good term, because there's muscle memory, there's memory in your tissue, there's memory in these response patterns that are there. Then there are all kinds of defenses against trauma. So dissociation is one aspect of it. So blocking things out, avoidance. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to go back. You had an accident on the freeway. I'm not going to drive anymore on the freeway. Or, you know, something really painful happened, you know, in this place. I'm not going to go there.
Today, what do you think the most common reason for trauma is, or the common trigger? It's
really difficult to say. I mean, we have, you know, so many external, you know, traumas like natural catastrophes, fires. We have accidents, mass transportation accidents, a lot of relational trauma.
I can see that being a very
abuse.
big one.
Yes, child abuse, sexual child abuse, or, you know, And the earlier, the more disruptive it might be. If you think about children, how much more vulnerable they are and how much less coping mechanisms and defenses they have developed. So then the earlier trauma happens, the more disruptive it can be.
So I know we talked a lot about like trauma from some factor, something happening. Could there be trauma due to lack of something happening as well, or is that not characterized as trauma?
Yes, so there's a very interesting concept which we can talk about, which we call, complex trauma. So there's a distinction that we make at times between the big trauma and big T trauma, meaning these are distinct events that are profoundly traumatic and disruptive. So a car accident, the diagnosis with a terminal illness, murder, that's a very distinct event that you can pinpoint. And then we talk about little t trauma. This is something that is about growing up in an atmosphere where your needs as a person growing up as a child are not met. And they are significantly not met, but they accumulate over time. So it's the neglectful parenting. So child neglect is highly traumatic, not meeting the essential needs of a child that can be as basic as not getting enough food, growing up in places where you're not protected, being homeless, unhoused for a prolonged time.
So I'm guessing for the big trauma, it's like when something happens to you, then that gets invoked. But then I think for the little t, you said, for little t trauma, is it more like, is that one more mental? And then something like lack of mental or like a feeling that you get invoked within you happens? Is that correct to say?
So we would say that's, the fundamentally, over prolonged time, a child, being either, emotionally abused, so we wouldn't have that specific incident, where maybe a parent completely lost it and flew off the handle. But it's like that's constant, humiliation, abusive language, disregard for the experience of a child, just not showing up. I mean, so many, when I think about also my work, so many experiences over time come up where parents did something that they may not even recall, but they become kind of paradigmatic of what happened in childhood, right?
Wow.
So where a parent got so upset with the child and chased the child out of the house, and the child really feared for their life, ran away, and they really recall that as a profound threat, And the parent may just thought like, yeah, I was just upset with my child, but it becomes this really terrifying event that kind of gets encapsulated.
Right.
And often enough, the person for a long time doesn't even remember it. And so it may then later come up when you really talk about childhood experiences and memories, and they recall something.
And then it gets invoked, and then they recall the trauma. Okay, I see.
But this will stand in, it may be, in psychoanalysis we often call that a screen memory. So the screen memory, Dad was so upset because I spilled the milk and or dropped something or broke something, and he chased me out of the house, and I thought he would really kill me. But it may stand in, we call it a screen memory because it is behind that screen is the whole history of a dysfunctional and really scary relationship.
I see.
And that's why it's more about the little t, because this accumulated, this may have been a father who so often flew off the handle and lost hold of himself and became this really threatening object, or person to them.
Okay. And then would you say like for lack of a relationship, like it could affect people in their future with their future relationships?
Absolutely.
Like even if something small happens and they weren't considered, or like some communication wasn't had, it might cause like lashing out due to
Right.
invoked childhood trauma.
Yes. So these are, there's a little bit always the danger that we overuse the term trauma and
I can see that.
that everyone is like, oh, I'm so traumatized, oh, traffic was so bad, I'm so traumatized.
That was me today.
Yes. So we want to be careful and really acknowledge that in order for someone to be traumatized, usually something very serious has to happen. There's an interesting concept also that Robert Stolorow, he's a psychoanalyst and philosopher, world-renowned, but from Los Angeles, and he talks about this, that trauma basically is an event that disrupts an existential sense. It has a very existential component. So we can say it's a psychological event. It is an event that has somatic and physiological aspects. It is a spiritual and philosophical event because it changes how we think about the world. It changes everything, our outlook on the world, of how we see life. Robert Stolorow himself talked about this in a very interesting way because he shared his personal experience. So he wrote a whole book about trauma and human existence, I believe is the title. And he talked about how he lost his first wife in a very sudden way to breast cancer while they had 2 young children. And how it changed his whole sense of his existence, right? That you suddenly realize that in a matter of months, your entire life changes, your sense of life. And suddenly, he described it in a really good way, that as a person who had this profound loss that was traumatic, he just found himself completely alienated from his life, from other people, and that he, had an experience that was so overwhelming and so different from what other people processed or talked about.
Right.
So you feel like nobody else has this kind of experience, and nobody wants to talk about it or can talk about it.
Yeah, so this is a little different from what we started off with. What we started off with was events that can trigger trauma, and then we talk about absence of trauma. This is just completely changing your view on the world completely.
Yes, and so what we see when people, or what the personal experience of trauma can be, that it also changes so much your sense of yourself, your sense of others, your sense of your connection to others. So this goes back to, it tears your life apart. You might want to avoid others because you're overwhelmed and distressed.
And you think they wouldn't understand.
They wouldn't understand. You feel ashamed that you are traumatized. So shame is a very strong component in trauma. At times, self-blame and guilt. What is wrong with me that I have been punished by life in this way, or what did I do wrong? When it comes to accidents, why could I not prevent this from happening? So these are all parts of it, and I think the one of the aspects, especially when we look at it also from a contemporary psychodynamic view is that we always say trauma happens in a relational context. So no matter what occurs to us, we are always embedded in a network of relationships. Mm-hmm. It also then depends on how the environment reacts. And so when we talked earlier about childhood trauma, it's often directly relational. But even other forms of external events that seem, like an earthquake, we have no part in causing that, we know, or a fire, but the question is are we able to turn to others? Are others there to help us with it?
Right, yeah.
Are they understanding of our situation? And so often enough, we, as human beings, we lack an understanding. I remember that, and I've heard that repeatedly, that people who have had a significant loss, after 6 months, people tell them, why are you still grieving? It's already 6 months that your father died,
It's like that's a shocking thing.
Yeah. And so, that kind of lack of understanding and lack of responsiveness is of course really damaging.
It would drive them further away.
Yeah.
Make them feel more alone.
Right. So I think every traumatic experience tends to be embedded, in a relational context. So if your house burns down, you have to deal with insurance companies, and you have to deal with neighbors, and you have to worry, of people not understanding what it really means.
Yeah, so that's crazy because I think you just tied everything back together. It's like one fire, this external trigger can also affect our worldview on things as well and make us feel more
Right.
to that last point of trauma that you talked about.
So, people who have been displaced, by the fires, for example, here in California, a lot of people lost their homes. And of course, what helped them the most was possibly having friends who say, you can move in with me, come to our place. Or, we have a guest house, if you're so lucky, that you can move into. Let me help you, initially, because people didn't have anything. They had no cash, they had no, let me help you. Let's, start a GoFundMe. And so, if you're so lucky, that really helps you in that situation. And a lot of people I've talked to pointed out that this helped them more than anything, to have friends, with whom they could sit together, with whom they cook. Yeah. And many people are not that lucky, that they, so that they have friends who have that kind of resources to take you in, to, give you a room, to help you recover, who are understanding. And it looks very different if you have to move with 5 or 6 people into a hotel room
that you don't even know.
Yeah. And
there's no other option for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's can just eye-opening how much everything just ties together. I think it's not something that normal people typically think about, how these big events and these small events all tie together to make you invoke certain feelings.
Right.
You are starting a doctorate program. Can you tell us a little bit more about that before we jump off for today?
The doctorate program that we start at SCU it's called the Rice Davis PsyD in Psychodynamic Psychology. And Rice Davis, because this program in some form existed before at the Rice Davis Graduate School. Mm-hmm. And so it has a long tradition that goes back to 2 doctors, Dr. Rice and Dr. Davis.
Who would have guessed?
And those 2 really started working early on in Los Angeles. And I think in the 50s, 60s, they built a place to really help children. and use psychodynamic principles of psychodynamic psychology. And so we really wanted to keep that understanding, a developmental understanding of psychology and human development. And we really strongly believe that, that earliest experience are very fundamental and foundational. They are formative. We strongly believe that that's really important. And even when we work with adults, that's why we often want to explore how people's upbringing was. And so we strongly believe that that's helpful and meaningful.
What type of people would be great for this doctorate program?
All right, so this is called a postmaster's doctoral program. This is particularly a program designed for working professionals who already have a master's degree in a mental health field. So it could be a master's degree in psychology, master's degree in social work, master's degree in marriage and family therapy, counseling, that maybe someone who is a licensed professional counselor. In fact, it doesn't necessarily require that they are licensed, but that they have the master's degree. But we wanted to offer a program to people who are already in the field and they realize that they really love the work, but that they feel a little bit limited, that they feel like there's more to it. I want to go deeper with my clients. I want to have a deeper understanding of what works in therapy. I want to get a better, theoretical understanding and research background. And that's basically where we come in. We want to work with people who are really interested in the clinical field, who just have a hunger to go further. And
how long is your program?
The amazing thing about this program, which is really rare, it's that we designed it in a way that it's 3.3 years. Mm-hmm. So, most postmasters program are at least 4 years. Because the PsyD is more a practical degree, it's not a pure research degree, we decided to design in more with a doctoral project, doing, comparative case studies or creating a treatment manual for something very specific.
Right.
So it should be a little bit more applicable to the field, and
yeah, that's great.
To make this more, succinct.